Good evening. My name is Roger Cohen. I'm a columnist for the New York Times, and I'm here tonight with Professor Fritz, whose most recent book, just published, is Zu Hause in der Ferne. And we're here to talk about President von Weizsäcker and his legacy and what kind of leadership is needed today in the world. Fritz, good evening.
Good evening, Roger.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Great pleasure.
You knew President von Weizsäcker for many, many years. Perhaps you could begin by telling us how you met him and what your first impression of him was.
I guess I knew him in the 1980s, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, and we corresponded a good deal.
Mm-hmm.
He exuded a certain kind of authority, I would say. And at the same time was open and interested in hearing what you might have to say, and so on. And I was immediately very, very impressed by him. And we'll probably come back to it, but it just occurs to me that probably early on, quite early on, I had the sense here is an ideal liberal conservative.
What do you mean by that?
A good liberal should be open to the new ideas, for what we mean by the word liberal, and open, free, and conservative at the same time. It's got to be conserved. It doesn't come from nothing, so to speak.
Right.
Got to be conserved. And the combination in a particular person is very, very impressive. And there are very few people in the world who has that. I think people will remember him for that magisterial speech
Of 1985.
of 1985, of May 8th, 1985, which, as a matter of fact, Marion Dönhoff and I witnessed together in her tiny room where the television was. And
Did you know what he was going to say?
No, he wrote me afterwards that something I had written about National Socialism as temptation had actually helped him. He was very generous in acknowledging it. In that sense, once I saw where he was going, I could, I was hoping, but it was an amazing speech.
I mean, leadership, obviously, great leadership involves courage. How courageous was that speech?
I think the courage came from within. It was a courage for him to say all these things, and they were magnificent. I mean, to say that the day of capitulation, the day of unconditional surrender, was also the day of liberation. That took a great measure of courage, and assuming that he is saying something for the people who are listening and for the ages, for a long time to come.
And that broke new ground. That hadn't been said in those terms.
Not in those
before.
terms.
Even we're now 40 years after that capitulation.
And also, I think I don't remember every line, obviously, or not even every formulation. But I think he also acknowledged the complicity of the Germans in the horror. I regret how many people have forgotten some of the great achievements of the last 50 years, which are in part associated with Weizsäcker. We talked about German-Polish relations, and the very creation of the EU was something that one could have foreseen once the coal and steel union began. That the triple leadership of de Gasperi, Robert Schuman, and Adenauer was a very, very impressive team.
So what's happened to leadership of that stature in the world today? Of the stature of Weizsäcker and the men you mentioned. And you said indeed that the Federal Republic throughout its history on the whole had been blessed with a high level of leadership.
Of political responsibility. It's of course an amazing piece of good fortune that this very important event that Roger and we are missing in Berlin, but I wish all the participants all best success, and so on. And how fortunate it is that it's in English and not in German, because to talk about Führertum would make life more difficult.
More complicated.
Yeah. I think it was blessed in the sense of having responsible political statesmen, beginning, as I said, with Heuss, with Adenauer, and so on, something that was denied to Germany in the Weimar period, except maybe for Gustav Stresemann, but not in the kind of key position where you would have wanted him. But that's a long story.
If you'd asked Weizsäcker what are the attributes, the core attributes of a true leader, what do you think he would have responded?
You have to create, encourage trust. I think that's extremely important in leadership. And I think Weizsäcker was able to do that. I also think that a good leader, particularly in a democracy, but not only, would serve as a kind of also as a political educator. That is, a political education is, to my mind, very, very important in political leadership. But I would put trust first, and the necessity of leadership, of being open, of communicating, second.
What about being able to see beyond tomorrow? It often seems today that we're so buffeted by social media, by technology, that leaders are worrying about the next hour, maybe if we're lucky the next day, but certainly not their legacy or such monumental changes as were achieved with great patience with the unification of Germany, for example.
Right. Roger, you've raised a question that weighs so heavily on me. I mean, this whole notion of the absence, or the virtual absence of genuine leadership, and the presence of the babble of the social media, the 24-hour-a-day presence, and inevitably it becomes banal, trivial, with exceptions, of course. But the danger is that it does, by its very existence and by the fact that I think there's a very important German word which I've used in a different context for the United States, as a matter of fact, which is, the Germans talk about Verdummung, which in the face of complexity, and obviously the world is infinitely complex now, and more complex than in times past, then the temptation to simplicity, simplifying, is very, very great.
Is it time for a speech from Chancellor Merkel about the future of Europe?
Not at... I imagine it'd be kind of difficult to do it in the middle of this kind of crisis.
Yeah.
And she'd be accused of, as she has been accused of, moral imperialism and all that kind of nonsense. I think she's been very good. I think she... I must confess that I was less impressed by her handling of the Greek crisis last year. But I think she rose to this occasion. With the refugee crisis. With the refugee crisis. Yeah. And she, a child of East Germany, I would assume she remembers the deprivations and the enormous enticement, the enormous attraction of freedom.
Are there any leaders today that you think are living up to what you consider to be true leadership?
The absence of leadership in Europe is frightening, and as I've already indicated, I wish we could be more confident about our own capacity for leadership. It's hard to say any name except that of Angela Merkel, who's astounding, really. Just a triumph of, in a way, consensual leadership, of trying to, developing trust via Mutti.
Weizsäcker believed passionately in liberal and democratic values, the rule of law. Looking around the world today, those values are questioned, are challenged. We see different systems in China, in President Putin's Russia. Do you think those liberal democratic values that he embodied and that his leadership was all about are resilient and will prevail?
I sure hope so, but it will take a great deal of work on the part of a great many citizens in a great many countries. And we've got to make these values live. It's not enough to invoke them. In fact, I'm sometimes a little tired of invoking these without showing by example. And I think the Federal Republic, in its treatment, in its opening to the migrants, is showing something by example, which is very, very important, and to be welcome. I think we may be threatened by a new illiberal authoritarianism. But even if that were to happen, let us say a higher degree of authoritarianism, of which the most recent election in Poland could be cited as an example and so on, that too, I would say, one can hope, and I do hope, and I do think, there would be a passing phenomenon. And that the liberal, reformist open societies will prove, as you said, resilient.
Well, thank you very much, Fritz. It's always a great pleasure to be with you and be able to talk to you.
Likewise, dear Roger, and I enjoyed it. But I keep thinking with a certain amount of personal regret, because all this is, for me, just a substitute for being with all of you, with the forum, to which my warmest good wishes and my certainty that it will be very successful. I particularly miss not seeing Frau von Weizsäcker, and to her my respectful regards, and my warm regards to Carl Bildt and to Gesine Schwan, and to all of you in the audience. Alles Gute.
Alles Gute.